Hello everyone, and welcome back to my review of Hunter x Hunter. Today we're talking about chapter 405, Performance. I apologize that I'm a day late on this video. I had a pretty busy weekend, but rest assured I'm very pleased with this chapter as a longtime Bonolenov fan who's been waiting for him to both do more things and also have more of an established character. This chapter provided both things, so I'm very happy with it. The delay was not at all caused by a lack of excitement. So without further ado, let's get into looking at this chapter. To start, some people in the comments last video wanted a recap on what the Phantom Troop's doing. Obviously, the premise is they're here to kill Hisoka and find a treasure. But of course, they've split up in many directions, and it's a bit hard to keep track of where they are. So we have Bonolenov, who appears in this chapter. He's currently on Tier 1. Crollo, we see him in this chapter. I don't think it's outright stated, but it looks like he's in Tier 3. We see Shizuku. We don't see Shizuku. She was with Bonolenov and Crollo, but we did not see her this chapter. Maybe she's still with Crollo and we just didn't see her in panel, or maybe she's split off, or maybe she's also in disguise. We don't really know, but she was supposed to be with Bonolenov and Crollo, and she's not. It's almost certain she's not dead because Hisoka hasn't interacted with. Hisoka's been on Tier 1 as we've seen in this chapter. Um, so I assume she just split off on her own, or she's in disguise, or Crowley gave her something to do. Nobunaga, Finks, and Phaeton we've been following a lot. They're currently entering Morena's kind of territory at the end of this chapter. Franklin and Machi are both by themselves. They're on the same tier, but they're in separate rooms. Franklin's kind of in a dining hall, and Machi's in a bedroom somewhere. And lastly, Kaluto and Illumi were apprehended but not necessarily arrested by Mizaistam, and he gave them their own rooms on Tier 3, and Bodobai and Jinta of the Zodiacs are looking over them, or at least escorted them to their rooms. And of course, something more relevant for this chapter, immediately relevant, is that we saw Hisoka in chapters 392 and 393. He kind of just showed up randomly, and he knocked out Lynch and Zakuro, and then he got tickets from Henry to go to Tier 1. And that's where we see him, or well, Bonolenov in this chapter. And of course, the last batch focused a lot on Nobunaga, Phaeton, and Finks, and at the start of this chapter, they're on their way to talk to the KR family, or Char, whatever you want to pronounce it as. And something also relevant for this chapter is that in his last appearance, and I think in chapter 374? In the 370s, it's been a while is my point, Banana mentioned ability to Krello that can change appearances, metamorphosis, and we see that in this chapter. So to start with what actually happened this week, we start with seeing Hisoka, the real Hisoka, and this is actually the first time we've seen him since his fight with Crollo. He's a dealer on a casino in Tier 1, and after he kind of finishes up his shift, I suppose, he thinks about how he prefers one-on-one fights instead of ones against beasts such as the Chimera Ants in groups, such as Haukenberg's kind of Den Coalition. And this is interesting because it's outside of the fight with Crollo, it's one of the few moments we've seen Hisoka's thoughts. He's usually a character defined by his actions and his words, so we're getting a bit more introspection from him, which I don't necessarily mind. I think it's interesting. We also find out, or we see Hisoka, quote unquote, the same Hisoka we saw in chapters 392 and 393 watching over him. And this is revealed to be Bonolenov and his ability, Metamorphosis or Metamorphosin. And he turns into Owl, which is a pretty nice callback. And the way the ability works is he can transform into someone around as long as he's talked to them in the past. And there's no limit to body size, but he thinks that if the person he's transformed into is shorter than him, he can't remain transformed as long. This isn't concrete, but that's what he thinks. But anyway, yeah, so we do see him, and he kind of thinks about what exactly he was doing in chapters 392 and 393. It is very funny that it was Bonolenov. It makes sense, but I knew there were a lot of theories that Hisoka. I heard a lot of theories, and I believe that Hisoka was Crollo, and he was just borrowing Bonolenov's ability, or Bonolenov used his ability on him. But it's fun that Bonolenov is actually doing a lot because, truth be told, as much as I love him, I was expecting for him to die pretty unceremoniously in a way that Cordoby did. So I'm pleasantly surprised by his more active involvement. So in essence, when we see Lynch punch him, she actually did find out that he wasn't Hisoka. However, he noticed that Zakuro did not hear Lynch's ability, so he knocks out both of them. And then we find out he killed Lynch before she could reveal his identity and pretended to be her to fool her in chapter to fool. Sorry, he pretended to be Lynch to fool Zakuro in chapter 393. So yes, Lynch is dead. Um, I know a lot of people liked her design. I thought she was a entertaining enough character, but it's a shame. But again, it makes sense why he killed her, and while he doesn't seem necessarily remorseful, based on the fact that he doesn't kill Zakuro and that he does say it's a shame. So maybe he's a bit remorseful. He says it's a shame before he kills her. So, Bonolenov probably saw it as a necessity, and for his purposes, it probably was a necessity because she indicated her intent to go after the Phantom Troupe. We then hear Bono think to himself a lot, and he thinks that while the group might be looking for one treasure, Krillow's looking for a separate or additional treasure, which is an ability to kill Hisoka that might be on the boat. He also thinks about Krillow's more reserved nature, or the way he's putting on a front ever since Cordopi and Shawnark died. Also, the fact that he hasn't replaced Pakunoda suggests that he cares more about his members, his followers, than what he might suggest. And some people might be wondering, well, why wasn't he this torn up about Uvagin? He was, of course, torn up about Uvagin, hence the Requiem, but in this case I feel like it's more directly his fault, because he left Cordopi and Shawnark without their abilities, while with Uvo, at least he knew he could have died fighting Kurapika, and he went out to fight Kurapika on his own without Krello influencing him. So I feel like he has a fair bit of responsibility, he feels responsibility at least, for what happened to Cordopi and Shawnark. And Bono basically thinks that once everything is over, once Hisoka is dead, the troupe should retire or at least relax for a while, and Krollo can kind of end his performance and be who he really is around his family, essentially. We then switch to Krello as it's announced that Mr. Risnorth, who's apparently a famed philanthropist, died 10 years ago. It's the anniversary of his death since its televisation, and he looks very, 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 very similar to the man who killed I'm blanking on her. I'm so sorry. The one who killed Sarasa in the flashback, and that ties into the fact that he was violently murdered, which and nobody has ever taken credit for his murder. And then Krello kind of remarks that people are quite foolish for believing whatever they hear on the news, such as the fact that he's a good man. We then switch to Nobunaga, who's back at the KR base alongside, of course, Phaeton and Finks, and he basically pieces together Morina's plan rather quickly, or at least the terms of her abilities, which is pretty impressive of Nobunaga. And Tajao, who's the KR underboss, and we met him in chapter 384 briefly, he's on board with wiping the Haley out because, well, they're killing civilians, and that isn't really the Mafia's thing. The troop goes forward to confront the Haley, while Kenny reveals he's actually on Morina's side and thinks that she'll have to reveal her Joker. Now, we knew that Kenny wanted the troop dead, but I always assumed it was for the sake of balance. Here we actually find out that he is directly allied with Morena, or at least supports her, which will definitely be relevant in the future, and it seems like Tajao doesn't share that allegiance. We go back to Morena a little bit, and she gives Dogman, everyone's favorite character, a job. He can sniff out people based on their Nen type, and they want him to find someone who isn't awakened yet but would be a specialist if awakened, find them, recruit them, and then maybe have them design an ability that suits their purposes, since, a specialist has more freedom over their ability than most other Nen types, if not all of the other Nen types. So Dogman heads off with Sodom, who's the doctor, back alley doctor in Haley, and he can apparently teleport non-awakened users, which is very convenient for their plan. Meanwhile, the pigeon trio that Henry kind of scared off in chapters 390 and 391, they're committing mass murder to increase their level, which we know corresponds to the strength of their aura, so they can get revenge on Henrig. The chapter then ends with Nobunaga's group seeing something odd as Teja leads them to where Haley is. and it's implied that they might be about to discover Morena's secret, or the various bodies in the processing room, or maybe confront the Pigeon Trio. So, a 3v3 might be underway. Let's talk about some interesting panels this chapter. I'd like to start with the cards that Hisoka is showing to the group. We have 2 aces, 3 of hearts, 3 of diamonds, 3 of spades, and 3 of clubs. I'm far from an expert on card games, and they actually kind of talk about the rules of this card game, which is a little bit different than most in the chapter. But if anyone thinks there's some unique symbolism with the cards here, by all means post your theories in the comments. I'd love to see them because, admittedly, I'm not too well versed in what this can mean. Something that I've heard people mention is that the lady Hisoka is quote unquote dancing with in this panel looks like the seventh queen, and a lot of people are corresponding this with the theory that Belerainte may be Hisoka. I personally think it's more of a coincidence, but if he is Belerainte, it makes sense that he'll be thinking about his employer, or, well, it wouldn't be too far out of the question for someone like Hisoka. Something also interesting about Mr. Risenorth, and I actually have this panel in the next chapter, but we'll be talking about 2 different things. The background in his picture here is a forest, and that's of course another way of Togashi cluing us in on his nature as Sarasa's killer. Her body was found and she was murdered in a forest, so it's pretty clever, but also deeply disturbing that we see him against the backdrop of a forest. Now, something right below this panel is Krillo, who, in contrast to Risnorth, who's kind of on this big screen and everyone's watching him, he's dressed in his somewhat usual outfit, but it's shadowed, clouded. And maybe this is the effect of mobility, maybe it's just Togashi's drawing choice, but I like to believe that it kind of shows that he's kind of snuck into the crowd and that he's kind of overlooked by, well, society. They're focusing on Risnorth's death and kind of believing the news while they're ignoring Krollo, who, while he's become a bad person in his own right, was once just a innocent person overlooked by society, living in Meteor City. I really like the drawing of the processing plant down here. I don't have anything super specific to say about it, but I love how murky the waters are. There's still a lot we don't know about Marina and her plan, and I think the water here, or it might even be blood considering what's going on down there, um, is hard to peer through. Lastly, we see a panel focusing on the 777 seen in slots and casinos. Now, some people might say it's 777. Franklin is troop member 7, so something might happen with him. I also just think it represents Hisoka's kind of search for a fight. He doesn't like animals and he doesn't like group fights, but he's looking for those one-on-one fights, which are kind of like the jackpot for him. But it could also mean a menagerie of other things. A big theme about this chapter, and something that I've mentioned a little bit in previous videos, but it's seen a lot in this arc, are the masquerades, or the performances someone puts on, the difference between their inner selves and their outer selves. Of course, Succession War arc is full of people thinking and saying different things. There's a contrast between what goes on inside our minds and what we express to other people. This is more directly shown through Bonolenov's ability, where he quite literally puts on the performance of being someone else. We also see it in Risnorth's nature, while in this panel from chapter 396, he's talking about hunting and killing, quite literally killing children. And his kind of brooding, sinister expression here is contrasted by his smiling face, his career as a philanthropist, a very direct contradiction to his true crimes. So if we imagine this as his inner self and this is his outer self, it kind of fits in with the theme of a performance or a masquerade. Crow's demeanor is another big example. Throughout his appearances in the manga, there's been a large gap between how he presents himself as this kind of cold, uncaring individual, while he very much is fond of his family, of the Phantom Troupe, and he cares deeply about them. And this is something Bonolenov notices as an actor himself, that Krello is putting on this front of being serious, of being determined, and maybe even being unemotional, when almost everyone in the troupe knows that he's going through a great deal of pain. And that's part of Krello's tragedy of a character. He's been acting for so long, acting out this role as a villain to protect Meteor City, that he's kind of become a villain himself. He stared so long into the abyss. And while I think Krello is most likely dying in this arc, this could hint toward maybe some redemption right before he dies. Maybe he finally breaks the performance of being a villain and returns back to how he used to be. Who knows? Krill is my favorite character in this manga. Big drop, big reveal, I know. But and I'm just looking forward to what Togashi does with him. Lastly, Kenny's allegiance is revealed this chapter, and his kind of very calm, pro-balance nature is contrasted by him supporting someone who's quite literally trying to upend society. And I like how as soon as we find out that he's a double agent, we switch to Morena, and we see her scar, which I've mentioned before is kind of a symbol of duality. The scar cuts across her face, and we can assume that maybe on one end, this is how she presents herself to other people. This is how Bonolenov acts, how Krollo acts, how Riznorth acted as a philanthropist, and as Kenny acts as someone in favor of balance. For this tiny sliver on the other side of her face, the other side of this scar, could be their true selves that they're trying to hide. I don't know, but I think it is interesting that we see Morena's scar as soon as it's revealed that Kenny is a double agent. Lastly, as usual, we'll talk about next chapter. The preview in the scanslation said, "What side awaits Nobunaga and the others? The succession war rages on." Some people could assume this to be a Return of the Prince chapters, and it's possible we'll see them, but I think the succession war just refers to everything in this arc in general, so it's most likely going to be another Troupe chapter. We're most likely going to be following Team Nobunaga. We're going to hopefully see what they saw and maybe even see them fight the Pigeon Trio. We might also see Bono and Hisoka because some people believe that Hisoka's reference to playing by himself or playing even with himself, depending on the translation, could be that he's aware of Bonolenov following him and that they might have a fight. That wouldn't go well for Bonolenov, obviously, as he stated that he doesn't want to fight. He has no interest in fighting Hisoka because Hisoka counters his abilities fairly well. So if Hisoka is onto Bonolenov, that's not going to be great for him. And I'm a bit worried now that we might see Bonolenov die in a couple chapters, now that we've gotten a little bit more development out of him. And this is kind of a meta commentary, or not a meta commentary, but I'm metagaming, if you will, here. But if you go to Togashi's Twitter account, chapters 406 and 407 both seem to end with double spreads, as we've seen from the snippets of his manuscript. So we're seeing our first double spread since I believe chapter 384 or 385, when Theta saw Seraidnik's two Nen Beasts. Maybe the forest no, I think the forest in chapter 397 was also a double spread. But the point is, Togashi doesn't draw these as often as maybe other mangaka. And the fact that next chapter is ending in a double spread could mean that something huge is about to happen. What it is, I'm not quite sure, but I'd like to see what you guys think. So once again, sorry that this video was late, but I hope you're enjoying this arc as much as I am, and feel free to let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you, and have a good night or day.